How's everybody on council tonight? Good, Richard. Everybody's good? Beautiful weather. Great. I'm going to call the meeting to order. Is there any conflict amongst the council members here tonight? Seeing none, I need a mover for the adoption of published agenda tonight for the special meeting. Deputy Mayor Malash and Councillor Bowman, all in favor of that? It's carried. Thank you. And I'll go right to presentations from administration, and I'll go right to Lori if she's. Lori, go ahead.
One sec. There we go. Thank you, Your Worship, and good evening to council and to our team of administrators as well as members of the public. I wanted to take a moment to introduce the purpose of tonight's meeting and how it relates to our role as a municipality in the province of Ontario. We've all heard about the 2019 More Homes, More Choice Act, and its bottom line is to increase the supply of housing in Ontario, as well as to make housing more affordable. One of the things that the province has done since then is amended the Planning Act to require its 444 municipalities to have official plan policies permitting second dwelling units either attached or detached to a dwelling. In fact, it's mandated its municipalities to have the opportunity for residents to do both. In other words, they can choose to do attached or detached. How a municipality chooses to regulate those official plan policies is spelled out in the zoning bylaw or its zoning bylaw. Knowing our housing prices continue to climb in the town of Essex, knowing that one day our children or our grandchildren or our aging parents or our caregivers may struggle to find affordable housing, we are proposing to give our residents strictly that: more homes, more options, more choices. Our planning services team, under the leadership of Rita Jabbour, our manager, has embarked on over 3 months of research, collaboration, consultation, evaluation, and more to get us to a point where you as a council, in representation of the general public, your general public, can learn about our own proposed amendments to the zoning bylaw. So Rita's here tonight to take the lead on the presentation. I'm here as well to take on any questions and hear from any delegates if there are any. And as a reminder, which Rita will speak to in just a moment, tonight decisions on the zoning bylaw amendments are not to be made, but rather here to learn about and to hear about what the proposed amendments will look like. And at our next council meeting on April 19th is when you'll be able to make those decisions. So thank you, Mr. Mayor, and the floor is now yours, Rita.
Thank you, Lori. Go ahead.
Through you, Mr. Chair, I'm always excited to present on zoning bylaw amendments. So good afternoon, everyone who may be watching tonight. As Ms. Chadwick said, this is a long time coming. We've gotten a lot of interest in second dwelling units, especially in detached structures. So I'm very excited to present the results of that survey and that feedback tonight. So I'm just going to give the Clerk's Division a moment to pop up the presentation on the screen, and I shall begin. Thank you, Shelley. So as Ms. Chadwick said, we're here tonight to consider second dwelling unit policies and regulations for the town of Essex. Next slide, please. And as Ms. Chadwick also stated, the purpose of this meeting is to hear public feedback, to hear feedback from council, feedback from administration on new official plan policies and zoning bylaw regulations related to the construction of second dwelling units. We do not make a decision at this time. That decision will be made at a later date, probably April 19th, unless council chooses to wait. Next slide, please. Before we delve into second dwelling units and what they actually are and what the proposed regulations are, I wanted to give council and the public an opportunity to understand some of the planning jargon that's going to be used tonight. Our first definition is Planning Act. The Planning Act is really at the top of the planning pyramid. It's provincial legislation that sets out the ground rules for land use planning in Ontario. Under the Planning Act, municipalities have to have official plans, and official plans are essentially municipal policy documents that set the general land use planning policies for the town for specific land uses, such as agricultural land uses, residential land uses, and industrial land uses. From the official plan comes the zoning bylaw, which is a set of municipal regulations that provide the legal framework for implementing the objectives and policies of the official plan. So if in the official plan we stipulate that we want to see second dwelling units, the zoning bylaw will establish how those second dwelling units will be regulated with respects to size, with respects to location. So again, providing that legal framework that our bylaw enforcement officers and our building officials can use to issue those permits and enforce council's regulations. And finally, ancillary is a term that's going to be coming up quite a bit. It means a use which complements and otherwise provides a service to the main use of the zoning district in which it is located. An ancillary use would be a garage. A garage is clearly complementary to a single detached dwelling, semi-detached dwelling, or townhome dwelling. You use a detached garage to house your vehicle, to house your lawnmower, all the implements that you need to maintain your property. So ancillary uses are clearly either secondary, they're not the primary use of the property, and they're not permitted on their own without that primary use. So a garage would not be permitted on its own without that dwelling being first and foremost. Next slide, please. So as Ms. Chadwick also pointed out, this is the reason why we're here tonight. In 2019, the province of Ontario passed the More Homes and More Choice Act, which purpose it was to increase the opportunities for a wider range of available housing. We all know that we're facing a housing crunch. We're seeing housing prices at historic levels. So the province really picked up on that and decided to amend the Planning Act to have official plan policies to authorize the use of 2 residential units in a dwelling, being a single, semi, or townhome, and a residential unit in a building ancillary to a dwelling as a way to increase the housing supply. So doing it by means of intensification. I just want to note here, though, that although we will authorize these policies, that the province allows us to authorize these policies, it's really up to us, and each municipality will differ on how we are to regulate these dwelling units, such as where they're going to be accommodated in our zoning bylaw, in terms of the levels of service, such as parking, and in terms of their size and just their overall appearance. Next slide, please. So second dwelling units is the official term the town of Essex uses in their zoning bylaw, but they're actually referred to as additional residential units in the Planning Act. To my right is a graph I got from the city of Hamilton. They actually created a manual on second dwelling units, and it shows all the different types of terms people may use to describe a second dwelling unit. So for example, if a second dwelling unit is located inside the principal dwelling, it can be referred to as a basement apartment, an accessory apartment, or an in-law suite. If it's located in a completely detached structure from the principal dwelling unit, it may be referred to as a laneway house, a backyard suite, a coach house, or a carriage house. But for the purpose of this presentation, we're going to stay consistent with our zoning bylaw and call it a second dwelling unit. And I've condensed it further. The acronym is going to be SDU. So what are SDUs? They're essentially self-contained residential units within a main dwelling or within a detached structure located on the same lot as that main dwelling. They include their own private kitchen, their own private bathroom facilities, sleeping areas, and entrances there too. So they're essentially additional dwellings for people to live in on a long-term basis. Next slide, please. Here are some examples of a second dwelling unit. The first two are examples of second dwelling units in the main dwelling. So you have a second dwelling unit in the basement, a basement apartment. You can have a second dwelling unit within the main dwelling on the second floor, an apartment second dwelling unit. You can have one, so on the bottom left there, you see the primary unit, but you can have a second unit even attached to that primary unit. Or you can have one in a completely detached structure as exemplified at the bottom right hand corner there. Next slide, please. There are many benefits to second dwelling units. So, I mean, in terms of the provincial objectives, we know that they support our strategic plan and our official plan in increasing the supply and range of affordable rental accommodations. They support changing demographics by providing more housing options for extended families, elderly parents, or for a living caregiver. As Ms. Chadwick noted, it's becoming harder and harder for individuals, especially millennials and even younger, to enter the housing market because of skyrocketing prices. But we're also seeing changes in that elderly parents don't want to go to nursing homes. They want to stay close to their kids, and they want to live on the same property, but they want the same independence that they enjoyed before. Second dwelling units also make more efficient use of the existing infrastructure and the existing housing stock, because we are not taking more agricultural land and converting it for residential purposes. We are not creating more lots. These are existing lots with existing homes. The opportunity is there already to connect to the existing infrastructure. In terms of infrastructure, in terms of land use, there is no uneconomical or unjustified expansion of those two functions for second dwelling units. I need to make this very clear though, second dwelling units are not to be used as short-term rentals. They are to be used for affordable rental accommodations on a long-term basis. Next slide, please. So the town of Essex actually currently has second dwelling unit policies in the official plan. We were actually mandated to include second dwelling unit policies back in 2012, and I believe we made those amendments in 2014, just before I came on board, to our official plan, but they gave you the option of either or in terms of where you can put a second dwelling unit, unlike today where you have both options. So section 4.22 of our official plan is the section with respects to residential intensification and affordability. For those who want to explore a little bit more, this section goes on to talk about second dwelling units. And in terms of how the town of Essex feels, we support the opportunity for our residents to create second dwelling units. And we support one second dwelling unit in a dwelling and in buildings ancillary to the main dwelling and general locations as set out in the land use designations of the official plan and the zoning bylaw. So if you can think back to the definitions specifically about the zoning bylaw, even though it's permitted in the official plan, that zoning bylaw is really going to dictate where and how they're going to look like. Next slide, please. Our official plan also contains policies regarding lands designated agricultural. And in those policies, we'll talk about permitted uses. So the official plan does contain policies with respects to second dwelling units and agricultural areas. And it states that they are permitted within the main dwelling and an agricultural area. And similarly, but with a little bit more benefit, for lands designated residential, the official plan states that they're permitted in a dwelling or in a building ancillary to the main dwelling. So you can see the difference with the two between agricultural and residential. For those who reside on lands that are designated residential and zone residential, you have a little bit more flexibility with where you can put your second dwelling unit as opposed to if you lived in an agricultural area. Next slide, please. So here are our current regulations respecting second dwelling units in the zoning bylaw for residential districts. You can see that I have a picture to the right, which has the last box crossed out. Now, this is used here to just provide an example of where the second dwelling unit in a residential district would be permitted. So as you can, pictures speak 1,000 words. As you can see, our zoning bylaw currently does not allow it in a detached structure in a residential district, but they are allowed within a single semi or townhome dwelling unit in select residential districts. So mainly those residential districts that are not 3-season or mobile homes. But again, we don't allow it within a detached structure without having that applicant provide a site-specific zoning amendment application. So there would be an extra step for that landowner in order to provide a second dwelling unit in a detached structure in a residential district. Next slide, please. So this slide here explains where second dwelling units are permitted in our zoning bylaw for agricultural districts. And again, pictures speak 1,000 words. They're not permitted anywhere as of right. So although we permit them in our official plan, our zoning bylaw does not. So a person who would live in an agricultural district who was wanting to even put a second dwelling unit in their main dwelling would require a site-specific zoning amendment. Because the official plan only speaks to second dwelling units in agricultural districts and main dwellings and not detached structures, as of today, a person who wanted to put a second dwelling unit in a detached structure in an agricultural district would not only require a site-specific zoning amendment, but would also require an amendment to our official plan. Next slide, please. So here we are, we're requesting amendments to make life a little bit easier for those wishing to install a second dwelling unit, whether you're in a residential or in an agricultural district. So in order to permit them in an accessory building to a house in an agricultural zoning district, we need an amendment to our official plan. An amendment to an official plan, because we are lower tier, has to be approved by the manager of planning services for the County of Essex after Town of Essex Council gives its blessing. We've already had those preliminary discussions with the county planner, and they've indicated that there would be support for such an amendment. We can submit an official plan amendment as well as a zoning bylaw amendment to allow SDUs and accessory buildings and agricultural zoning districts at the same time. So there is no time wasted in having to do both applications. Something that is very specific to second dwelling units, there are no appeals of official plan policies respecting second dwelling units. Because it's so important to the province to have these policies and municipal official plans, the province has taken that right away. Next slide, please. As I discussed, we'll also need some amendments to our zoning bylaw. So for our zoning bylaw, we need to make amendments to permit an SDU in a main dwelling in the agricultural district and within a detached ancillary structure on the same lot as a main dwelling in both the agricultural and in select residential districts. And those residential districts will really be the same as today. So anything besides 3-season occupancy residential districts and mobile home parks. An SDU, or sorry, a ZBA, too many acronyms, is also necessary in order to implement regulations respecting the location and the number of second dwelling units permitted on a lot, the maximum floor area, the height, the parking, the setback regulations between property lines and existing structures. So the zoning bylaw amendment, even though the official plan sets those policies, the zoning bylaw amendment is what's going to go really in depth in terms of regulations. Approval of the zoning bylaw amendment is only required by Town of Essex Council. And again, the province, seeing as second dwelling units are so important to the housing stock in Ontario, has relieved municipalities of this appeal process, even for zoning bylaw regulations. Next slide, please. We do have one regulation we must abide by, and that's Ontario Regulation 299/19 respecting additional residential units. With respects to this regulation, each second dwelling unit needs to have one parking space that is provided and maintained for the sole use of the occupant of the additional residential unit. The parking space, and this is strictly from the regulation, may be a tandem parking space, which essentially means it's a parking space which can only be accessed by passing through another parking space from a street, lane, or driveway. An additional residential unit may be occupied by any person regardless of their relationship to the landowner. And an additional residential unit is permitted regardless of the date of construction of the primary residential unit. Those are the only regulations the province says we have to include. Otherwise, it is completely up to us to decide to determine where and how such dwelling units will be accommodated in our zoning bylaw regulations. Next slide, please. So because this is going to be a zoning bylaw amendment and official plan amendment that affects all, agricultural and residential lands within the town of Essex, we made sure we went above and beyond what would normally be prescribed for public consultation of such applications. We created a survey on second dwelling units to garner public feedback, which was open from March 11th to the 26th. We created a web page on our website specifically on second dwelling units to host information and links to documents and surveys. And that web page will stay open, but once passed, it'll be more of informational again, respecting our policies. We publish advertisements in both our local newspapers, the Essex Free Press and the Harrow News. We publish multiple posts to Town of Essex Facebook and Twitter pages. We created a media release and we sent it to the local media outlets and the community contacts, including the BIA, the Chamber of Commerce. We also posted it to our corporate website. And we purchased a $100 Facebook ad campaign geo-targeted to Town of Essex residents. Next slide, please. In terms of our outreach and outcome, the media release was published in both the local newspapers and AM 800. We received 157 survey responses. Our Facebook video got 11 shares and 11 engagements. 1,600 people were reached. That's 1.6 times higher engagement than other video content. Our Facebook post, which was boosted through that paid ad, reached 5,370 people. There was 198 link clicks, 386 engagements, including 34 shares and 25 comments. The combined web traffic to our second dwelling unit webpage and online survey was 1,667 page views. Some very good stats. Next slide, please. These were the 8 questions that were posed in the second dwelling unit survey. So we really wanted to get a feel for where our respondents live, were they urban or rural? If rural, did they reside on a farm? Do you support the option of having a second dwelling unit in either a main dwelling or detached structure? How many people wish to construct a second dwelling unit? Is there support for opportunity to have that second dwelling unit in an agricultural zone? Do you support limiting the size? And for the purpose of the survey, we chose 750 square feet because that is the size limit for an accessory structure currently under our zoning bylaw. And do you agree or disagree that it should be restricted to 1 story if it's in a detached structure or on the first floor of an existing 2-story accessory building? Again, when we talk about the maximum size and the height, we're really using our accessory building regulations just kind of as a template to get public feedback. So what did the survey say? Next slide, please. In terms of our respondents, the majority consider themselves urban and the majority were from Ward 1 and Ward 3. Next slide, please. The majority of our respondents did not reside on a farm. Next slide, please. But the majority of our respondents do support a second dwelling unit in a main dwelling or detached building in the agricultural zone. The majority of our respondents also supported a second dwelling unit in a main dwelling or detached building in a residential district. Next slide, please. The majority of respondents, 63%, are actually considering constructing a second dwelling unit. That's enormous. The majority of respondents, of those 63%, wish to construct a second dwelling unit in a detached structure. So you can see that there's appetite for these types of units, especially in detached structures. Next slide, please. The majority of respondents, though, don't support us limiting the size of a second dwelling unit in a detached building to 70 square meters, which was 750 square feet. Next slide, please. Additionally, the majority of respondents don't support limiting the height of a second dwelling unit in a detached building either to 1 story. Next slide, please. In terms of the public comments we received, because we provided respondents the option of providing comments above and beyond and just answering the questions, the majority of respondents felt this was a viable and necessary option for those seeking extra income through rental property or those seeking affordable housing options, especially for parents and aging family members and young individuals such as adult children who cannot afford to enter the housing market. Some of our respondents even provided, personal accounts of how they wish to accommodate their children or themselves with the support of their children on their property. Other comments included were with respects to that ground floor limit. So respondents just felt that 70 square meters is not sufficient to accommodate a family or generate sufficient rental income to support the investment. Respondents also voiced support for the option of having a 2-story unit or a unit on the upper floor of an unattached building, such as a garage, just to utilize an existing building space, as well as respondents expressed some concern that second dwelling units will be used as short-term rentals. And as I explained earlier, these are supposed to be long-term rentals. They are not supposed to be short-term rentals. Next slide, please. We also posed the regulations and the policies to agencies. So in terms of the feedback, we heard back from the Essex Region Conservation Authority, ERCA, who had no objections, but requested further consideration and dialogue as it relates to second dwelling units in flood-prone or hazard areas. In terms of our response, we state that we have to permit second dwelling units. The province mandates it. Any structure, any second dwelling unit structure that's planned to be constructed in a ERCA regulated area is no different than a main dwelling or a garage. They would be subject to ERCA approval. So the authorities at ERCA would make sure that they have the proper flood-proofing measures that they prescribe for any building within their regulated area. We heard back from our Infrastructure Services Department, who stated that we won't permit separate service connections for second dwelling units, and that there may be an impact on servicing in areas with limited capacities. So in terms of our proposed regulations, even currently, we limit second dwelling units to areas where there is sufficient capacity. So similarly, you need to have sufficient servicing capacity and frontage on the street in order to get a permit for a second dwelling unit. We consulted with our building division and they had no objections. Second dwelling units, and this is very important to note, even though they may be permitted as of right in our zoning bylaw, they are still subject to building code regulations. You still need to get a building permit before you construct a second dwelling unit, either in your house or in a detached structure. And at that time, that's when we're going to look at servicing. That's when we're going to look at parking regulations to make sure all the regulations that are stipulated in the zoning bylaw have been complied with. And finally, we heard back from the County of Essex, who had no objections. They did mention that we should consider including policies in our official plan with respects to the severance of second dwelling units. So we don't want these units to be severed off in the future as their own lot in an agricultural district. So the County of Essex is simply recommending that we include policies under our policies in our official plan that state that no severances of second dwelling units will be permitted. Next slide, please. So in terms of our proposed policies and regulations, again, this is all feedback. This is based on feedback that we've received from the public and based on feedback that we've received from administration and the county. This is what's actually come about. So the proposed amendment to the Town of Essex official plan, under that section with respects to the agricultural land use policies, we are simply looking to amend that paragraph to read 1 second dwelling unit in the main dwelling or in an accessory building to the main dwelling. So now it's clear, you can have either both. Next slide, please. with respects to our zoning bylaw. So we are looking to amend the definition of a second dwelling unit to read as follows. Anything you see bolded is brand new. So as a second dwelling unit would be defined as a dwelling unit constructed within a second detached dwelling, semi-detached or townhome dwelling unit, and this is new, or in an accessory building to a single detached dwelling, semi-detached or townhome dwelling unit for the purpose of providing full-time residential accommodation of a person or persons. It's important to note that in this definition, we are giving people a choice. You cannot have a second dwelling unit both in the main dwelling or in a detached structure, but you can have either or. And this is really to limit some of the negative impacts of increased densities in residential areas especially. Next slide, please. We currently have a whole section on second dwelling units. So we're going to revise that section to allow an option, again, for allowing a second dwelling unit in that main dwelling or that detached structure in agricultural and select residential districts. But again, not in both, to limit the adverse impacts to infrastructure, to mitigate any parking issues, and to mitigate any impacts to our development charges reserves. Because with the More Homes, More Choice Act, there also were changes to our Development Charges Act, which states that development charges are waived for a second dwelling unit, but only if one doesn't currently exist. So if you have one in your house and you have one outside your house, you can only get it waived for one of them. And that will have impacts on our reserves because we have to make that up somehow. So this is really to limit that. We're also looking to revise the policy to allow a 2-story second dwelling unit if not located within a required yard. And I have diagrams in the next couple slides to really explain what a required yard is. And we're also looking to revise that section to allow a maximum floor area that's going to be dictated not by a number that we come up with, but by the maximum lot coverage regulation that we already have prescribed for that respective zoning district, but no greater than that floor area of that primary dwelling. And again, this is mainly to ensure there is no impact to our development charges reserve, because in terms of waiving development charges, that second dwelling unit cannot be larger than that primary dwelling. Next slide, please. So in this slide, I just explain a bit more by way of a graph and some text about the 2-story option for second dwelling units constructed outside of a required yard. So a required yard, and this is strictly from our zoning bylaw, is defined as an unoccupied and unobstructed open space from ground to sky required for each individual zoning district, except for encroachments or structures permitted in the zoning bylaw. So with reference to the illustration of yards and yard setbacks, you'll see the area that's denoted by a dotted line. Okay, this is your building footprint. So if you're in the R11 residential district 1.1 zoning district, which permits single detached dwellings, you have a 25-foot rear yard that you must maintain. So on the diagram, you see an area that says rear yard, and there's an arrow that goes from the back lot line to the main dwelling that says rear yard setback. That would be the 25 feet that's required. And that area between those arrows, that is your required yard. So that is the yard that's supposed to be free and clear of any obstruction. That is supposed to be your amenity area. This is where people like to relax, have their backyard parties, and this is where they want to have their privacy. So in terms of that 2-story option, we're just going to flip over to the next slide. I show what the proposed policy and regulation would look like. So the first one would be for a situation in which a detached second dwelling unit is located in a required yard. And for most people, they may want to convert, especially if you're in an urban area and you have an existing garage, they may want to convert a garage that's already 4 feet from a rear lot line or a side lot line into a second dwelling unit just to make use of the existing building stock. And especially because lots typically in urban areas are a lot smaller than lots in agricultural or rural areas. So if you were looking to construct that second dwelling unit in that required yard, there would be a limit that we are proposing in our zoning bylaw to 1 story, because we do not want people infringing on other people's amenity areas. Now, that doesn't mean that circumstances are going to arise and someone wants to make use of an existing garage and they want to keep their garage, but they want that second story for a second dwelling unit. That it doesn't prevent them from trying to get approval for a second story in instances where it's going to be required or where it's going to be located in a required yard. They would just have to apply for a minor variance to permit that second story for a second dwelling unit. And in that situation, we will trigger the public consultation process, the public notice process for those neighbors that are really going to be impacted. Now, if someone has a larger lot, or even in urban areas, you still have big lots, and they wanted to construct a second dwelling unit in just outside of that required yard in that building envelope where I have the arrow indicated, then that's the instance where we would allow a 2-story second dwelling unit, because it's not infringing on anyone's amenity area. It's no different than the existing main dwelling. And like I said, we're going to see a lot of these instances where, people are going to build 2 stories because they have the space in rural and agricultural areas, but maybe not so much in the residential areas. But again, you still have that flexibility to apply for a minor variance in circumstances where there really is a hardship and you can't meet it. Next slide, please. In terms of the maximum floor area, I stated that it's going to be completely dictated by the maximum lot coverage regulation instead of us putting in a square foot amount for a second dwelling unit. It's just going to be based on the existing maximum lot coverage regulation for that respective zoning district, but again, no greater than the floor area of the primary dwelling. So I give some examples here, and I know it's a little bit hard to see, but the first one is concerning a residential district. In a residential district, you could have a single detached dwelling, you can have a garage, and soon you can have a second dwelling unit. But your lot coverage, being the area that's covered by all buildings at grade, cannot exceed 40%. In residential districts such as Pleasant Valley, so these are more of the rural residential districts, you have a lesser lot coverage, which is 25%. But you have obviously a 10-acre minimum, so you have a greater lot area. And the last example you see there, even though there isn't a title, is actually the agricultural area. So similar to Pleasant Valley, it's 25% as well. But again, you have a greater lot area, so that flexibility is a lot greater for the size of that building. Next slide, please. So in terms of next steps following this meeting, we will prepare a report to council with the proposed bylaw and the proposed official plan amendment for hopefully April 19th for your regular council meeting then. And then following or at that meeting, council may approve the official plan amendment as presented or defer decision if they want us to make further amendments to the proposed regulations or the policies, or if they require further information on both. Or council may choose to approve the zoning bylaw amendment and the official plan amendment, or again, defer that decision. If approved, that material regarding the official plan amendment will be submitted to the County of Essex for approval. And again, this is strictly for agricultural districts and SDUs in agricultural districts. And if the county approves, the notice of the official plan amendment and the zoning bylaw amendment for SDUs will be published in local papers. And like I said earlier, there's no appeal period, so it'll be effective right away. Next slide, please. Here's a little example of a 400 square foot garage in Harrow. And it's an example of what a second dwelling unit can look like. That's the end of my presentation. I thank you for your time, and I'm really looking forward to your questions. I know that was a lot of information to digest, so fire away.
Thank you, Rita, for the presentation. I only have one concern. I like the idea of tiny homes. It's much needed in our area throughout our municipality. The only thing I have a problem with is how do we enforce the short-term rentals? I mean, over the weekend, I had 2 complaints about problems at short-term rentals. So how are we going to enforce that?
Through you, Mr. Chair, and that's a question I was anticipating. So planning services, working with infrastructure services in the clerk's division, we are working on zoning bylaw amendments that are going to regulate short-term rentals. We're hoping to have an open house and a public meeting similar to tonight very soon. So short-term rentals will be addressed under that project. And in the meantime, we're also working on a business licensing bylaw as well, so that when we present you with the short-term bylaw, we'll have a means of enforcement as well. So all I can say for now is alerting the public that these are not to be used as short-term rentals and that we will be regulating those very soon.
Yeah, to be honest with you, presently, we do have a problem with some short-term rentals and where they're at, and problems with the neighbors. So like I say, I had 2 complaints over the, but anyways, okay, I'll open up. Thanks for the presentation, Rita, was excellent. I'll open it up to council. Councillor Guerin, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Good evening, everyone. Rita, fantastic report. Lots of thought and work put into it, considering all the variables that are in play, and there's lots of moving parts, so I appreciate all that. I'm all for solving the problems of housing shortages and affordable housing, and I do like the idea of this. I guess I have some concerns, like Mayor Snively said, with the STR. I'll get to that in a second, but the second unit detached SDU and possibly second story ones is also a little bit of a concern, only because where I live in my neighborhood, I look in my backyard and I'm trying to picture a 25-foot by 30-foot dwelling in my backyard. I got 4 neighbors abutting up to my side property, 2 on my back and 1 on my other side. And they all put them up. I mean, it's going to be Sardine City where I live. But I do think there are some areas where outside of maybe the subdivision where greater lots might be able to accommodate this. So that's kind of my immediate concern with that, with the privacy of to our neighbors and such. And then I also have a concern with the parking and the enforcement of parking. Like right now in a yard, I might have a driveway that holds 2 cars or 3 cars, and I put a building in the back. I'm just concerned about street parking being taken up by a lot of the rentals. I don't know how we enforce that. I don't know how we predict that there's a dedicated spot in that person's driveway for that car. I assume that the tenant would have out with the landlord, and then from there, complaints would come through our department and we'd have to try to enforce it. So I don't know how we do that. And then on the STRs, I agree with Mayor Snively. Now, we could be having STRs in some of those approved SDUs right now, though, right? If you have a basement within that's permitted, those could be being used as short-term rentals, and we would never know it. So my concern, again, with the short-term rentals, even though we're working on regulations and such, is how in the world are we going to enforce those bylaws when we do come up with them? So love the presentation, love the idea of thinking outside the box and trying to find ways to help people make extra income by doing these and solving a problem with the housing, but it comes with some concerns. So I'm waiting to hear from the rest of everyone, and great presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Councillor Guerin, who's next? Who'd like to speak? Councillor Bowman, you're next, and then Councillor Bjorkman.
Thank you, Your Honor, and through you. The one comment I had, and I thought it was well done, and thanks to Rita for such a fine presentation, is the fact that the way these units are being designed, they won't be able to be severed at a future date and become issue, especially with no separate services and all that type of thing. They all feed off the main building. So I think that really prevents them from being separated as separate units at a different time and sold off. So I think that's a well thought out move. And thank you.
Counselor Bjorkman, you're next.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. Through you to Rita. Yep, very good presentation. As we've talked before, it's good to get the questions answered in the presentation. Most of the things that I'm looking for are already there, and I appreciate Councilor Bowman even mentioning, because I wasn't sure. I just wanted to ensure that all the services for this SDU come through the primary residence. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, so again, keeps us from, so I think it's a tremendous idea for our rural areas and our agricultural. There are a lot of people with lots of room out here. There's demand for rentals, and if we keep them to a reasonable size, they'll rent for that amount. To Councillor Guerin's point, I'm also concerned with what it's going to be like in our subdivisions, how much room they can put there. I do like the idea that it should just be a one-story if it's out in the required yard space, so that you're not putting somebody up above somebody else's fence and out in those areas that people want to use and keep their privacy. They got pools and stuff in their backyard, so that's really important. I would like to see, though, we're talking about not having the square footage greater than the principal residence. I would go further than that. We want, this is a extra building. This isn't the same building. So I would like to see, using the building envelope as part of the restriction, but I wouldn't want to see two houses that are 1,400 square feet on the same property. Like, one of them should be smaller. It's the rental property, and that's what we're trying to do is bring additional property. And so I would like to see some sort of restriction there where we keep it to 50% of the size of the main building. So it's no doubt that this is a small home. We're not trying to put another family of 6 on a piece of property that already has a family of 6. 12 more people or 12 people on one property, especially in our residential areas, is not going to go over well. But otherwise, we've got issues to look at here. But great report, and much needed, especially in our rural area. Thank you.
If you'd like to respond, go ahead.
Yeah, and through you, Mr. Chair, thank you, Councillor Bjorkman, for those comments. So I believe that in the urban areas, because your lots are a lot smaller than in the rural areas or agricultural areas, it's likely that your second dwelling unit is not going to exceed the size of your main dwelling. So I just wanted to make mention of that. But certainly in the agricultural areas or, the rural areas, Pleasant Valley especially, there is that opportunity, but definitely it will not exceed the size of that main dwelling.
Just responding to Councillor Bjorkman and Councillor Guerin. I can see Councillor Guerin's concerns. Shouldn't we be looking at the lot size of the primary lot to be a certain size before we allow one of these smaller homes to go on? Is that something we could look at? It's got to be a minimum of size before another dwelling can go on that lot?
So through you, Mr. Chair, the regulations are really up to you, but you shouldn't make them so restrictive that people can't have a second dwelling unit on their property. The province has been very clear that these are permitted. So I would just caution that the regulation isn't too restrictive and that some people can't lawfully have one.
I understand that, Rita, but I'm going to respond to Councillor Guerin's concern, like where he lives. I can't see another dwelling being on his lot. Okay, like his lot size is small now. To allow another dwelling on there, I think we're going to run into problems. So that's just my thought, and I'm maybe the lot size should be a minimum lot size to allow something like this. So that's just my view. but it's up to council. If anybody can respond to that, I appreciate it.
And through you, Mr. Chair, I can respond to that. So like I said, we're initially thinking about that minimum size being 750 square feet, because even on a 40 by 100-foot lot, you could still have a garage that's 750 square feet, so long as you don't exceed that lot coverage. But we have that maximum lot coverage, which basically stipulates what it is, 40% for all buildings at grade. So we feel that covers it. In terms of a maximum lot size, a maximum building size, you're really restricted to that 40%.
I think Councillor Bowman, I think you had your hand up, and then Councillor Van and Don after Councillor Bowman. Go ahead.
Thank you. I think she just answered that question, but we do have minimum lot sizes and minimum lot sizes. And we already know with some of the new subdivisions, there isn't even enough space to put a shed in those backyards. And you're still maintaining that percentage of green space. So I think those numbers are already in place. Thank you.
Don't get me wrong, Rita and Laurie, I'm all in favor of this. Believe me, there's one hell of a shortage of homes, and we all realize it. Council realizes it. So I just want you to be aware. I'm not against this at all, but I want to make sure that we're not opening up a can of worms here for smaller lot sizes and allowing another dwelling. Laurie, no, Councillor Van and Dolan, and then I'm going to go to you, Laurie.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you to administration, thanks to Ms. Jabbour and Chadwick for a very detailed presentation. I agree with, I think, all of it. I'm just a little bit worried it might be too complex, and a lot of people are going to be disappointed when they find out they can't do this. But there's going to be some bumps along the way with this. There are going to be some problems. Mr. Mayor, you said, well, we hope we don't open up a can of worms. Well, we could deal with a few worms. It's better than not doing this. We need to do this. And some people have been advocating that this change be made for almost a quarter of a century. So it's overdue. My question is, what are the other towns near us doing? What's Amherstburg, Kingsville, Lakeshore? Are they pursuing this as well, or are we the only one? Where do we stand there?
So through you, Mr. Chair, I can answer that. So in our region, especially Essex County, Amherstburg is the most recent to allow these. And they actually do include a size limit. I believe it's 30 square meters. But in the agricultural area, I think it's as big as you want, except it's covered by lot coverage. So they're the closest municipalities that have implemented these policies. I believe Leamington, a lot of municipalities like Tecumseh, Leamington, they're in the process of amending their official plan. So they're using that process to make way for second dwelling units. I say this with a lot of, just pride. Essex was one of the first municipality in Essex County back in 2014 to implement second dwelling unit policies in their official plan. So even though this is a little bit different, we're doing it now, we were the first. The other municipality would be City of Windsor, and City of Windsor actually allows second dwelling units in both the main dwelling and in a detached building. And I think Councillor Van der Dolen, you brought this up. There was an article in the Windsor Star about the height restriction on a second dwelling unit. So in terms of height, it just can't be higher than the main dwelling. Those are the only two that I know.
Thank you, Rita. I'd like to put a stamp on this, to be honest with you. Just want to be cautious on the lot size. That's my only concern with this, the lot size that allows second dwelling. So anybody else from council? Councillor Bondi, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you to Mr. Jabbour and Ms. Chadwick. Great job on this. This has been something that many in our community have been looking forward to, and a part of that affordability package. Now I think we will hear some concerns. I've already heard one during this meeting, so we'll have time to address them when it does come back. I have the same concerns as my fellow councillors about how do we regulate and stop it from being turned into an Airbnb. at some point, right? So I've heard that, and I've also heard parking concerns, especially in the urban areas. Street parking people like to park on the street, but nobody likes street parking next to them, right? If they're doing it, it's okay. But if your neighbor's parking on the street, it's not okay, right? I got a message today about street parking. So I think it's something that we have to do and we have to proceed with to allow people to live in our community. I have been talking to some people that have filled out the survey that, this is not for them to rent out. This is for their family members. And it's for their elderly family members now, and then it's for their children later, or possibly them, and then somebody can live in their house. So the housing crisis is so real. You can't find a house in our municipality for less than 250. And there's just another one that came through on my app right now in a trailer park, and it's listed for 225. It's probably going to go for $3. So this is really one of the only options that we can keep going forward with. So I look forward to adopting it when it comes to council. And if anybody else has any further feedback, email council members, or you can also get on the agenda next time it comes back. So councilmembers@essex.ca. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Councillor Bondi. Just to respond to you on prices of houses, I was talking to somebody this morning, and they put a bid in on a house for renovation there, and they were going to sell it, and went for 100 and something thousand over. And I guess people from the greater Toronto area lined up to buy homes down here. That's what's pushing the prices. So Deputy Mayor Malash, go ahead.
Thank you, through you, Mr. Mayor. And one of the concerns that I had was about location on the property. So I think we need to watch for that, particularly I would say in rural areas where some of the homes are set back quite a ways from the road. I don't know if we're going to be allowing for an additional structure to go in front of the existing home, or does it have to be at the side, and there could be some concerns in neighborhoods about where that house is going to be, or additional structure would be going. So I don't know if it's, you talked about converting garages, but I'm talking about entirely new construction. And I would imagine this probably has to do with in rural setting where the septic bed is at, because you'd have to connect the additional structure to the existing septic bed is what I'm guessing, and existing water line. So, but yes, great report. Thank you so much for bringing this forward. And I'm all in favor of this as well. I know we're going to have some bumps to contend with, but all in all, it's going to be a much better situation than what we have right now for those persons that are having a difficult time finding a place to live at a decent cost. One of the other questions that I had was with regard to infrastructure. Let's say that 25% of the homes in either Harrow or Essex Center decide that they want to pursue this, and they build an extra structure. I know that everybody has. So now all of a sudden you have these additional bodies living in those particular wards, and we have a certain amount of sewage capacity. So when we bump up the number of people that we have living and filling those sewage systems, do we have any concerns there?
Go ahead, Rita.
So through you, Mr. Chair, to Deputy Mayor Malash, we anticipated possible concerns because of increases in density. So in my presentation, I noted that the proposed regulation would also include mention of the ability to service that second dwelling unit. So at the building permit stage, it has to be established that there is sufficient capacity to service that dwelling. I also want to make mention to council that this is really like a test bed. So as you know, you've gotten zoning bylaw amendment applications before you before. So really we're testing out the waters. We're seeing how these regulations do. And we're also hoping to get some stats working with our GIS team, our infrastructure team and building to identify where these permits are issued so that we can do proper planning when it comes to budget time for infrastructure if needed.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. Mayor, just one further question. In regard to development charges, can you just repeat for me what the scoop is with development charges as far as if somebody wants to put a second dwelling on their home?
Yeah, so through you, Mr. Chair, always a pleasure to talk about development charges. So development charges are waived as per the More Homes, More Choice Act. It made amendments to the Development Charges Act and prescribed a whole new regulation stating that we need to waive them for second dwelling units. However, I think what was explained to council before, just because a development charge is waived at the building permit stage does not mean it's waived for the town of Essex. So there are certain instances where the second dwelling unit may exceed the size of the main dwelling. That portion that it exceeds, that main dwelling size needs to be refunded into our DC reserve because the regulation concerning that only waives it for a second dwelling unit that does not exceed the main size of the main dwelling, the size of the main dwelling. The regulation also speaks to second dwelling units and detached structures. So waiving it in that case, but not waiving it in both cases. So if you're like City of Windsor and you're allowing a second dwelling unit in the main dwelling and in a detached structure, you're going to have to refund your DC reserves for one of those. So that's the scoop on the development charges.
Okay, thanks for giving me that information.
Councillor Verbeek, you're next.
Okay, through you, Mr. Mayor. Again, thanks to administration. I'm really grateful for all the work that went into this. I'm really hopeful that we can move forward with it much in the state that it is now with a few tweaks. I would like to see some stipulations where there's some controls in place where parking is limited. My in-laws live in a neighborhood very similar to Councillor Guerin's, and pre-COVID family functions, there was always a race to be the first ones there because there was very limited parking. When I was going through this, I was thinking I just love everything about it. I'm glad it's going to give some people an opportunity to make a little bit of income. It's certainly going to, open up a little bit of housing opportunities. And I do see a lot of multi-generational, as many of you know, my mother's living with me right now, and man, be nice to put some space on for her, right? But I just wonder, we have a lot of places especially in my ward, where the lots are 5 and 10 acres large. Is there a place in this there that someone could put 2 or 3, tiny houses, or could this grow in that direction at all? When someone's got 10 acres, if they're willing to provide a couple of tiny houses, is that something we could look at?
Rita, can you answer that? I see you got your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, certainly. So in rural areas and agricultural districts, you're limited to that main dwelling. And if we pass this, you're limited to that second dwelling unit. So a maximum of 2. The province really restricts residential development in agricultural areas and in some rural areas, especially. So the probability of, a subdivision or like a little compound of tiny homes is really, really low, and it has to start at the provincial level with changes to policy.
All right. Well, thank you for that. It was just something that crossed my mind when I was reading through, because there's a lot of places in my ward that have 5-10 acre lots that are never going to be farmed, right? But thanks for that.
Councillor Guerin, you had something else to say? Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you to Rita or Lori, just back on the parking thing, can you talk a little bit to us about the driveway allowances? So in my subdivision, I don't have curbs, and in a lot of the urban areas in town here, you'll see where There's not even a gutter. There's just basically cars parking on boulevards, cars parking on front lawns. Let's say I do have the space to put one of these second dwellings up in my backyard, but out front, I only have the capabilities of side-by-side 2 cars. Can I just simply go next to that and put in cement and add a third for this extra dwelling? Or is there an actual driveway allowance that we have to follow? And I think that's where we're going to run into some problems, because if there is a driveway allowance, people are going to say, well, I got the space for it, but my house is so close to the road, I don't have the parking for it. This isn't fair. But I just wonder if you could talk to that. Thanks.
Go ahead, Rita.
For you, Mr. Chair, absolutely, I can speak to that. And Kevin, Director Gerard, feel free to jump in. So we do have driveway allowances, and they're found in our development standards manual. You're only allowed 1 driveway per lot. And within the zoning bylaw, we have a maximum width for that actual driveway, and it's 25 feet. So yes, we do have regulations in both of those manuals that people will have to prescribe to. With respects to parking, I know it's an issue. I served on the Committee of Adjustment, and anytime there was a variance for, a lot width to allow perhaps a semi-detached dwelling that was permitted in the zoning, that was the main topic of contention that came up, was parking. And as I noted in my presentation, the proposed regulation is going to stipulate that 1 on-site parking space is a requirement in order to get a permit for a second dwelling unit. So at the building permit stage, the applicants are going to have to satisfy our CBO by way of a site plan to show that there is adequate parking for the second dwelling unit and for the main dwelling. And that basically complies with provincial policy.
Okay, so just further that, if I could, Mr. Mayor. So I see around town many driveway cutouts, curb cutouts that are 25 feet wide, let's say. But then once you pull in, the driveway opens up more into their lawn, where they're going 3 wide, and we're permitting that. Is there a variance that these people are getting for this? Is there a variance stage we can go to, a person can go to if they want that extra space? Or how are they doing it? The ones that have it now.
Answer that.
So through you, Mr. Chair, if I can. So our zoning bylaw only prescribes the width in terms of how far they want to pave onto their lawn. We have no regulation prescribing that. Our lot coverage definition really only applies to buildings. It doesn't apply to any paved surfaces. So they can pave as much as they want, but that width of that driveway is limited to 25 feet.
Anybody else from council? Once again, I want to thank both of you for, okay, go ahead, Laurie.
Thank you, Your Worship. I was hoping you would say anyone from administration. I just wanted to add something to Ms. Jabour's presentation tonight and to cover off some of the questions that you pose as councillors in representation of members of the public that have may shared some concerns with you individually or as a whole. The building permit stage that Rita has already spoken about is really where the regulations in our zoning bylaw would be checked off one by one, as well as building code requirements, such as servicing, such as changing the use from an accessory garage to a livable space, such as even the zoning regs for a number of parking spaces, et cetera. The building permit stage, upon intake, our building technician takes a look at the application and is it complete? And then, and only then, is that then handed to the CBO or the building inspector for review, for plan review. There will be those regulations that we won't see something, for example, on by right, a permit handed at the reception stage, if you want to call it, or building permit stage, where there is an issue with lot coverage. At that stage, when the CBO or the building inspector reviews those plans and deems it that, unfortunately, we can't give you a building permit, but your options are either revise your drawings, maybe there's an issue with lot coverage, maybe there's an issue with you are now proposing that second dwelling unit within the required yard. Those regulations that are there only allow the CBO to say, check, check, check. If they're not in compliance, then it's kicked to the planning division under the leadership of Rita to the committee of adjustment. Again, if let's say the proponent says, I've got a hardship, I only have a lot that's this big, I want to see if I can get a 50% lot coverage. The great thing about that is if they do want to proceed to the planning division for committee of adjustment approval, it's reviewed by a registered professional planner. The decision is made by a committee of council that has a duty to look at these 4 tests of a minor variance. They are housed with making these decisions in the best interest of the community. There is a public meeting component. So things that would be of concern to you and perhaps would be of concern to the surrounding neighbors for instances where someone cannot meet the regulations, there is a public component, there is a review taken place by planners, and of course, again, the decision being made by a committee of adjustment through the lens of these, the 4 tests of a minor variance and the policies that bind us, such as our OP and our zoning bylaw, and really that intent of the zoning bylaw. I did want to make mention of that. Parking, we talked about parking already at length. We talked about services. Shared services would be a requirement, again, reviewed during that building permit stage. The location of second dwelling units on properties, that's all determined during the building permit stage according to the regulations. So really great process in that we wouldn't be permitting something that is, 2-foot setback or a, 15-foot setback when you're encroaching into that rear yard. I think that was it on that. So thank you, Mr. Mayor. I just wanted to throw those 2 cents in. Lastly, Rita did make a great comment that we've heard from our resident senior planner, Jeff Watson, who likes to say that this is that test. Like, we wanted to throw this out there to you guys. If there's something that you want us to say, it's a no-go. We want you to implement a maximum square footage for the second dwelling units. This is your chance. So we've thrown something out there for your consideration, our professional opinions and our professional recommendations. Now, really, it is up to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Rita. Thank you both for the presentation. It was a very, very good presentation. A lot of discussion, a few concerns, but really minor concerns. I do agree with Councillor Garino, and I do believe that we should have a minimum lot size to allow this. But anyways, that's my opinion, but it's up to council. So I'll need a motion to accept the presentation tonight. Councillor Garin and Councillor Bowman, all in favor? Thank you. Thank you, council, for the great discussion, and thank you to Lori and Rita for the presentation. So at this point here, we'll wait and see if there's any, go ahead, Councillor Bjorkman.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And just a question to our planner and the director. Are you asking council, so you're going to come back to us with a bylaw. Are you asking us at this point in time, are there particular things we want to see in that bylaw, or have you received enough from the discussion that you'll present something that we can discuss at a later time?
For you, Mr. Chair, and I don't know if Lori wanted to speak, but
It's okay, go ahead.
I know for my purposes, I've gotten a lot of constructive feedback, and it's enough for me to at least draft a bylaw for you to consider. In my report, I'll note all your concerns and how we've tried to address them. And of course, it's your decision. So I have everything I need.
Wonderful. And just to add to that, thank you, Rita, and through you, Mr. Chair, to Councillor Bjorkman. At any time, whether it's a zoning bylaw or another bylaw, you are able to defer. In other words, if you see that there is something that you don't want to have those 3 readings on Monday the 19th, you can maybe have us defer until the next meeting if you would like something changed. It doesn't it's not a huge impact. It just delays things for the next council meeting. If you want 2 readings and then come back with a third, I'd have to talk to Rob about how that logistically works. But we certainly will have something proposed on the 19th in terms of a bylaw, and whether you choose to approve it for 3 readings that night or postpone, we can take it as it goes.
Thank you, Rita. We could, that night, we could make changes though, couldn't we? We could make a change if referring to the lot size. So you're going to look at the lot size, right, Rita? You're going to look at the lot size and come
Through you,
back with the
Mr. Chair.
minimum.
Yes, all the concerns
Okay.
brought up tonight, the parking, the lot size, we'll do our research and we'll present that in the report at the next
Okay.
meeting.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Rita. Any other questions? So, okay, I think I already called the motion. All in favor of the presentation? Yep. Carrie, thank you. And then I need a motion to adjourn to the next meeting, please. Councillor Bjorkman and Councillor Guerin, all in favor? Carrie. See you at 6 o'clock. Thank you.